Hey guys, this video is intended to give you a brief overview of Marxist critiques of international relations. This week, I'm going to have you read an excerpt from the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels. And in addition to that, I'm going to have you read an article written by an author by the last name Wallerstein, which was written in the 1970s. He's going to give us what we call neo-Marxist perspective on international relations. So first, let's go over some basic terminology, just in case you aren't familiar with Marxist ideologies or the Communist Manifesto. Maybe you've never read any portion of it before. I know a lot of you guys have. However, I just want to make sure we're all starting off on the same page. So this idea of who owns the means of production is really important to understanding any Marxist critique. The means of production are just anything that we use to produce something of value. I know that definition is kind of vague. It doesn't really tell us a whole lot. So let's use an example. Let's talk about Starbucks for a second. If you wanted to, let's go back. If you wanted to open a Starbucks and sell coffee for profit revenue, you would have to have a space in a shopping center. In addition to that, you're going to need a coffee maker, an espresso machine. You're going to need a blender to make those frappuccinos, an oven to warm up the muffins, so on and so forth. Those are all of the means of production. That's what you need in order to make coffee or other products worth value that consumers are willing to pay money for. The people that work the means of production are the quote-unquote proletariat, according to Marx. So the proletariat are the individuals who work the means of production. However, the proletariat, those who work the means of production, are not in fact the owners of the means of production. They don't own that espresso machine. They don't own the blender. They just show up for their shifts and they go back home. And they only receive a small, very, very small percentage of the profit revenue derived from the selling of coffee to consumers, amongst other products. The bourgeoisie, on the other hand, those who own the means of production, derive the majority of the profit revenue. So I want you to think about Amazon as well. There are people who work in Amazon warehouses and package up goods that are going to be sent out to consumers. However, they don't receive the majority of the profit revenue. Instead, the owner of the means of production, the owner of that warehouse, the owner of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, he is the bourgeoisie. He owns the means of production. So Marx thinks that we can understand pretty much everything by looking at the conflict of interest between the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production, or in other words, just kind of rich people, and the proletariat, the working class, or the quote-unquote poor people. Now, when Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto with Engels, he was hoping for this idealistic situation in which the proletariat, the working class, would revolt against the bourgeoisie and they would take over the means of production. And then, to make a really long story short, the proletariat would take over the government. And that's because the government, according to Marx right now, right, or at the time of his writing, promoted the interests of the bourgeoisie and not the proletariat. So his hope was that the proletariat would take over the state and create a new government that would help us facilitate a transition from capitalism to communism. And then finally, when we achieved an economy or an economic system that was essentially communist, where the workers own the means of production and derive directly the profit revenues from working the means of production, he thought then that we could dissolve of the state and we could live in communes without a centralized state where we collectively own the means of production and we derive the profit revenue from owning the means of production. Now, so Marx, when he was writing, and Engels as well, they weren't really thinking about what this may look like on the international stage. Instead, he was sort of thinking about this happening within societies, within the domestic sphere. However, there are a lot of scholars who use this framework of thinking about everything as a class conflict, and they use that to make sense of international politics. So a Marxist critique of international relations thinks that unlike realists, right, unlike liberals, they think that economics, this class divide, this conflict of interests between the working class and the business owners or the bourgeoisie, that can help us make sense of international conflict. And their end goal, their ultimate kind of ideal situation would be a world society that ends up being classless, where there are no poor people, there are no rich people, we all have an equal standard of living, and the workers or the proletariat have taken over the means of production. So the Marxist critique of international relations thinks that instead of, well, actually, let me phrase it this way. Let's think back to realism and liberalism. Realists and liberals almost kind of just assume that the states that we as individuals live in are primarily interested in protecting our survival and promoting our interests. So I, Kendra, live in the United States, and the United States has my best interest in mind. The United States is interested in protecting my security and behaves in such a way to promote my security. Marxists don't think that way. Marxists think that because the state is only interested in protecting the interests of the bourgeoisie, we can't just assume that states are unitary actors and states are interested in protecting the well-being of all of its citizens. Instead, Marxists think that the state is really only interested in pursuing the interests of the bourgeoisie, right? So this tells us that when states come into conflict with one another, in other words, when wars happen, it's because there is some sort of class conflict going on. The interests of the bourgeoisie in the United States, in other words, may have come into collision with the interests of the bourgeoisie in Iraq or Afghanistan when we invaded in 2003, if that makes sense. In addition to that, if we wanted to understand why the Syrian civil war continues to go on, why the United States and Russia are fighting the Syrian civil war as a proxy war between each other, we would just have to look at the class interests, the bourgeoisie class interests in Russia versus the United States. And we would see that those interests are colliding in Syria. And that's why states, the state of the United States and the state of Russia, are pursuing that conflict with one another. Lastly, the Marxist critique of international relations also argues that capitalism is always expansive. In other words, the owners of the means of production are always looking to make more and more profit revenues. They're always looking for the cheapest form of labor that they can find. And they're, in addition to that, looking for more places in the world to buy and sell and trade goods and commodities. So the Marxist critique of international relations is interested in the ways in which big powers, economic powerhouses like the United States or states in Europe or the Asian giants, are engaging in kind of a de facto imperialism or colonization even today in order to find the cheapest labor, and in addition to that, find the best markets to sell their goods and services in for the highest profit revenues, right? So, in other words, you know, maybe the United States 30 years ago used the proletariat in China, the workers, the factory workers in China, to produce textiles and clothing. But then that labor got more expensive. And so then they moved on to, let's say, South Korea or parts of India. But then that labor got too expensive. And then finally, right now, the textile industry is thriving in Bangladesh because that is where multinational corporations that make textiles, let's say Levi's, that's where they can find the cheapest labor. Conversely, they sell those textiles in Western Europe, maybe, because that's where you can make the most money off of those textiles that are produced. So basically, to summarize, to sum all of this up, the Marxist perspective or the Marxist critique of international relations, its primary contribution is instead of suggesting that we make sense of international relations via states as the primary units of analysis, Marxists think that we should look at classes as the primary unit of analysis. And again, it's economics that are driving the politics, not the other way around. So lastly, I want to talk for a second about Wallerstein, who you are going to read after you read an excerpt from the Communist Manifesto. Wallerstein helps us think a little bit more from a Marxist point of view or perspective, but in a more modern context. So Wallerstein is famous for coming up with this world systems analysis theory. So he thinks that countries fall into three different categories. Countries are either core countries, they are semi-peripheral countries, or they are in fact in the periphery. So what do these terms mean? Well, the core countries are the really wealthy industrialized countries like the United States or Canada, for instance. Oh no, what happened? Oh, just kidding. Here we go. The semi-peripheral countries are the countries that are a part of supply chains and maybe contribute to the means of production, but they don't provide the raw materials and raw resources in order to produce goods and commodities. They're just sort of the middleman who assists with the transaction. So Mexico, for instance, Mexico would likely be categorized as a semi-peripheral country. Peripheral countries are extremely poor. These are third world countries that are providing cheap labor and raw materials. And then again, the core countries are the ones who are actually generating the most profit revenue and in fact consuming these goods. That's because the world is so globalized now, we have multinational corporations in the United States that are allowed to exploit the cheap labor in countries like Bangladesh. And in addition to that, maybe grow cotton for a very, very low price. But the profit revenue made off of the textiles that come out of that cotton doesn't go to the peripheral countries. Instead, it's the core countries that get to benefit from that generation of profit revenue the most. So in other words, peripheral countries stay poor. Semi-peripheral countries stay somewhat poor, not as bad off as the third world countries in the periphery, but the core remains extremely wealthy. So again, here, this emphasis on classes, the owners of the means of production versus those who work the means of production. Okay, let me know if you guys have any questions.